Have you ever imagined what it's like to be forgotten by your own children on the day everyone celebrates mothers? I'm not talking about a simple misunderstanding, nor a silly mistake. It's about truly feeling like you mean nothing to the people who should embrace you first. I felt it firsthand. I felt the silence, the weight of every minute waiting for a gesture, anything to remind me I still had value to them. No message came, no call, not a word. Just an emptiness that grew as the hours passed and the house grew colder. Flashes of that Sunday still haunt me. The table set, the coffee getting cold, my phone dead. And the worst sentence, received that night, that I never thought I'd hear from my children. You mean nothing to us. But before I tell you what really happened, you need to understand what my life was like before that day. I was born on March 11th, 1959, in Dayton, Ohio, right in the middle of the coldest winter I've ever seen. 65 years later, I still live in the same corner house, number 347 Maple Street, just a few blocks from the elementary school where my children attended. My parents, Evelyn and Richard, were ordinary people, the kind who woke before the sun to ensure life ran smoothly. My father worked on the assembly line at a tractor factory. My mother sewed for others, and it was from her that I learned to use the old black singer that I still keep to this day. From the age of 13, the sound of the sewing machine became part of my routine. At 17, I began doing small repairs for the neighbors, and at 24, I opened my own sewing room in the backyard. It was never a luxury, but every wedding dress, every school uniform alteration was an achievement. In 1983, I met Roberto. He worked as a package delivery man, always passing through, always in a hurry. We married in the summer of 1985 in a simple ceremony in the community hall of the Baptist church on our street. 2 years later, Lucas was born, and 3 years after that, Anna arrived in the early spring of 1990. Life wasn't easy, and soon Roberto began spending more time traveling for work than at home. Before I knew it, I was practically alone with the children, juggling bills, chores, rushed dinners, and the orders that couldn't be delayed. My routine hasn't changed much since then. Maple Street was always full of familiar faces, children playing, the smell of apple pie wafting from neighboring houses. Sunday mornings were sacred. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, Lucas always first at the table, Anna trying to get some more sleep. I already had my apron dirty with flour and the sewing machine ready for another round of dress alterations, especially during high school proms. I often worked through the night so as not to keep a client waiting. My fingers were always scarred from needles, but I looked at Lucas and Anna and felt everything make sense. I never let them go without anything, not even on the tightest dates of the month. I remember the impromptu birthdays, with supermarket balloons hanging in the living room, boxed cakes, and colorful candles. Money was always tight, but I never missed a school reunion or a trip to the emergency room when one of them got hurt playing in the snow. When Anna was 7, she broke her arm slipping on the icy sidewalk. I stayed up all night with her at St. Mary's Hospital, trying to distract her with stories while we waited for the doctor. These little things were the center of my world. In May of 2010, I received a commission I've never forgotten. A young woman named Samantha asked me to make a wedding dress from scratch, with blue details at the hem in honor of her deceased grandmother. I spent 5 nights working late, embroidering every detail by hand, barely noticing the passage of time. That same week, on a quiet evening, I picked up an old book from Anna's bookshelf, who was on vacation from college. One sentence stuck with me. No one goes unnoticed if they decide to tell their own story. That kept ringing in my head, and it was the first time I began to consider recording everything I felt in my diary, even if no one would read it. I've always been proud of what I've built. My studio became a neighborhood landmark. Everyone knew that if they needed a last-minute fix, they could knock on my door. At Christmas, my house would be packed, the smell of cinnamon, laughter, the sound of presents being opened around the tree. For me, all of this was more than routine. It was a sense of life. I made a point of recording every birthday, every pizza night, every conversation on the porch in my journals, which I began writing after that night with the book. I never imagined that one day, all of that would disappear out of nowhere, as if my presence no longer mattered to anyone. For a long time, I believed that love was enough, that my dedication spoke louder than any lack of gratitude. I thought that somehow my children would always understand what it meant to have someone waiting for them, no matter the hour. I never imagined, not even in my worst nightmares, that one day I would feel that all that history could be ignored by those who mattered most. But no one is prepared for that kind of silence, and it was precisely then that life showed me that the deepest scars are not visible to those who have never had to truly look. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt this kind of emptiness, of doing everything for someone and, in the end, feeling like no one noticed? Tell me in the comments the moment you realized your dedication was being ignored, or write, "I've felt this silence." Share your story with me. I want to know how you dealt with it. What comes after this silence? No one can imagine until they experience it firsthand. Mother's Day that year was May 12th, 2024. In Dayton, Sundays almost always start slowly, with the smell of damp earth wafting from the backyard and the muffled sound of neighbors working in their gardens. I woke before 7, a habit I've never lost, even after the kids left home. I went straight to the kitchen, turned on the antique oven, and started making orange cake, my mother's recipe, which was always a hit on those days. I set out the special dishes, laid the flowered tablecloth on the living room table, and arranged the china cups, silverware, and pitcher of apple juice, as if it were an unbreakable tradition. It was 9:15 when I put the cake in the oven to bake. The smell quickly spread through the house. I waited a little longer, arranging pillows, checking my phone on the table. No notifications. Around 10 o'clock, I started thinking about calling Lucas or Anna, but I thought it best to wait. I figured they'd show up soon, perhaps unexpectedly, knocking on the door with flowers or at least a bag of muffins from the bakery. While the cake cooled on the rack, I made fresh coffee, cut some slices of whole wheat bread, and got everything ready. At 11 o'clock sharp, the living room clock chimed 3 times, as it had ever since I bought it at a sale 20 years ago. My cell phone sat there, sitting next to the empty plate. I opened and closed the screen every few minutes, trying not to build anticipation, trying not to appear anxious. It was useless. My hands were cold, and every so often I glanced down the hallway, hoping to hear familiar voices. Outside, the sound of lawnmowers and children riding their bikes contrasted with the silence inside. I washed a cup and put it back on the shelf, then sat at the table for a few moments, watching the coffee smoke rise, waiting for some sign. Little by little, the set table became a reminder of what I wanted, not what I had. The smell of the cake seemed too sweet, cloying, as if it constantly reminded me that no one would taste it. The clock read 11:45 when I decided to microwave a slice. I ate alone, the taste a bit bland, without company. I picked up my journal and began writing the first lines of that Sunday. At 12:20, a message arrived on my cell phone. It was from Lucas. "We'll talk later, Mom. Today we'll be busy." I stared at those short words, trying to find some meaning, some sign of affection hidden there. I found nothing but haste, distance, absence. There was no kiss, no promise of a visit, just a cold excuse. After that, the day dragged on. Time seemed to stand still. The radio was on just to break the silence, and every time I heard a noise at the gate, my chest tightened, thinking it would be one of them arriving. But it wasn't. With each passing hour, that hope diminished, until it became just a sinking feeling, a mixture of anger and disappointment. In the living room, I sat in the armchair where I always watched TV with them when they were kids. I looked at old photos in the frame, trying to remember the last Mother's Day we spent together, unable to remember the year. I went back to the kitchen, put on more coffee, straightened the dishes, and put everything back, careful not to break anything. The smell of the cake had already faded. The sun was slowly sinking in the front window, and I no longer knew if I was waiting for them or trying to convince myself it didn't matter. That night, after 8, when my neighbor passed by on the sidewalk and waved, I sat back at the table, cell phone in hand, and wrote in my diary again. There, I tried to put into words everything I couldn't say out loud, how much it hurt not to be remembered, the emptiness of a day that should have been special. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the date, each word seeming to weigh more than the last. At 8:53, the message I'll never forget arrived. It didn't come from Lucas or Anna directly, but from a family group where they responded together without even mentioning my name. "You mean nothing to us." I stared at that sentence for long minutes. I felt my body go cold, my mouth dry, as if I were gasping for air for a few seconds. I finished writing everything down in my journal: the lack of hug, the silence, the whole cake, the untouched dishes, the sentence that tore me apart. I didn't sleep well that night, tossing and turning, trying to understand when things had reached that point. And it's strange to say this, but it was only the beginning of what really broke me. Stories like these cannot go unnoticed. You feel the weight of this abandonment, the impact of each silence, because it's impossible to hear all of this and remain the same. Leave your like now. Each gesture like this shows that these stories deserve to be heard and remembered. Subscribe to the channel, because the next turn is even more intense, and you won't want to miss what's about to happen. What came after that Sunday was something no one could ever have imagined. I sat for several minutes staring at my phone. I couldn't believe what I'd read. My head felt heavy, as if everything I'd experienced up until that point was gone. My fingers were cold. My face felt hot, almost as if I'd been slapped. I looked around, and the house seemed even bigger, as if the furniture had moved away. I wanted to scream, but I didn't even have the strength. Just silence. My hands felt sweaty as I tried to close the app, but I ended up just setting the phone aside, face down. I got up slowly, almost dragging my feet through the kitchen. I picked up the plate and cup that were still on the table and washed each one calmly, drying them with the already slightly damp cloth, as I had done for decades. Only this time, I wasn't in a rush, nor was I purposeful. The water ran into the sink, the sound filling the emptiness a little. But that was all. I put away each piece of crockery, stacking the cutlery, folding the floral tablecloth as if it were some kind of ritual. Every time I folded a napkin, I remembered Lucas and Anna as little children, running around the living room, fighting over who would sit next to me. The kitchen, which had always been the heart of the house, became nothing more than an empty, cold place, full of memories that now hurt rather than comfort. I glanced at the clock hanging next to the door. It was already past 9 when I finished packing. I couldn't think about calling anyone. I didn't want to hear advice or words of pity. I sat at the table, opened my diary, and wrote, my handwriting a little shaky, 65 years old, my first Mother's Day without children, without a hug, without a word. I felt a wave of anger mixed with sadness. I wanted to ask someone, anyone, at what point I lost my place in my own children's lives. I tried to replay in my mind every choice, every sacrifice, every time I gave up myself to prioritize them. Was it something I did and didn't realize? Or had I simply lost my importance over time, like an old piece of clothing no one wears anymore? The silence that night was more uncomfortable than any fight. There was no arguing, no slamming of doors, no harsh words exchanged loudly, only an emptiness that seemed to echo through the rooms, almost as if my existence had been switched off, cast aside without warning. With each passing minute, it only grew, until I felt like I could disappear without anyone noticing. I stood there, motionless, for a long time, listening to the noises outside, cars passing by on the street, neighbors talking in the distance. Inside, there was only the sound of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock. That was all. I closed the diary slowly and went to the living room, sat in the armchair, and tried to watch television, but I couldn't pay attention. My head was spinning, full of unanswered questions. At 10:40, I wrote one last sentence. Sometimes, silence hurts more than any scream. It was strange to feel this kind of emptiness after so long surrounded by people. I realized that night, being invisible was worse than any fight, any hurtful word. The truth is, I thought that was rock bottom, as if there was nowhere left to fall. But the way life is, I was about to discover that you can sink much lower when you think you have nothing to lose. On Monday, I woke to light streaming through the living room curtains. The house seemed even quieter, and it was as if time had slowed down just to remind me of everything that had happened the day before. I went to the kitchen, made a strong coffee, sat at the table, and realized everything was in the same place, as if nothing had changed, yet at the same time everything was different. I checked my phone again, expecting to find some overdue notification, but the screen remained blank, no sign of my children. As I warmed a slice of leftover Mother's Day cake, I began to hear the hustle and bustle of the neighborhood. My neighbor, Mr. Miller, was shoveling his driveway. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Harper walking with her 5-year-old grandson, the two of them carrying a bouquet of flowers for the boy's mother. I opened Facebook to try to pass the time and was met with an avalanche of photos, Children of classmates smiling, hugging their mothers, breakfast tables, captions like, "the best mom in the world," videos of balloon surprises, gifts wrapped in colorful paper. At that moment, the feeling of exclusion grew even heavier because I realized that there it seemed like I alone had been forgotten. It wasn't just the silence at home, it was the silence on the phone, on the internet, in every corner of life. I spent the rest of the morning trying to distract myself with the alterations I had in the studio. Deep down, I knew I didn't have the brains to sew anything properly. I picked up a white dress, the kind I sewed for a wedding in Springfield, and stared at the embroidery for almost half an hour, unable to stitch a single stitch. My hands were sweaty, so I dropped the needle on the table and went to my bedroom. I sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the old photos hanging on the wall. Each one seemed to scream a memory. Anna dressed as a fairy for the spring party of 1995, Lucas smiling with his front teeth missing on his 8th birthday, the nights they slept wrapped in colorful sheets after hours of playing in the garden. The worst part wasn't their absence on Sunday, but the way the world seemed to go on, unconcerned about whether I was okay or not. My body felt tired, my chest heavy, a kind of fatigue that isn't from lack of sleep, but from a lack of meaning. I went back to my journal, and this time I didn't mince words. I wrote line by line every feeling, from the initial shock to the silent anger of realizing I could simply disappear and no one would ask. Today, no one asked if I was okay. The sentence came out almost by accident, but when I reread it, I realized it was exactly what hurt the most. It was as if my existence had been erased from everywhere, not just from my children's hearts. I kept writing, trying to capture details I didn't want to forget. The sound of the refrigerator door opening, the sensation of sewing a dress while holding back tears, the smell of stale coffee. Every now and then, it felt like I was storing away proof that the pain was real, not just a figment of my imagination. The journal became a kind of protection, a way to keep my own name alive, even if no one cared anymore. That morning passed slowly. The neighborhood continued with the sound of family voices, cars coming and going, and I felt increasingly isolated from the world. If someone had asked me about my routine, I wouldn't have been able to explain how time had passed. All I could think about were the birthdays I'd never forgotten, the nights I'd stayed up sewing Halloween costumes, the winter mornings waiting for the school bus to arrive, all to ensure they had what I never had. The strangest thing was realizing that, while everyone else went on with their lives, it felt like I was the only one standing still in time. It was at that exact point, writing in my journal, watching the sun slowly pass through the window, that something inside me began to change, not because of them, but because of me. That sentence I wrote in my journal kept lingering in my head for the rest of the day. There was no point in pretending it didn't hurt. I spent hours pacing the house, from the studio to the kitchen, looking at everything I'd done for that family. Instead of giving into isolation, a different desire took hold of me. It was as if their silence had lit a spark I hadn't even known still existed. I remembered Anna's book, the phrase that had never left my mind: "Those who write their own story are never forgotten." I understood, right then and there, that no one was going to tell my story for me. If I did nothing, I would truly disappear. But if they thought they could erase me, they were mistaken. I decided I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't demand an explanation. I know my children well. I know that every attempt at direct conversation ends in a hasty excuse, in "we'll talk later," as if I were just another obligation. So I started differently. I went to the hall closet, opened the box of old papers, and, one by one, took out letters, birthday cards, recipes my mother had handwritten, faded photos of parties that only existed because I insisted. I sorted through wedding dresses I'd made over the last 20 years, taking off the hangers the ones that meant the most to me. Each one carried a different story, a woman who truly smiled at wearing something made with care. I laid everything out on the living room table, organized by date. Each object was concrete proof of everything I'd been and everything I'd forgotten over time. There, sitting in front of a pile of memories, I realized I could transform my pain into something stronger. I grabbed a pen and paper, sat down with my journal open, and began writing open letters to Lucas and Anna. They weren't complaints nor demands. They were just the truth, the way I'd always lived. I talked about raising 2 children practically alone, the nights spent sewing costumes for school performances, the fear of running out of money, the birthdays I'd make up for with just what I had at home. I told how I saved every baby tooth, every handmade drawing, every gift I bought with the little I had left at the end of the month. I wrote about how invisible I felt last Sunday, but most importantly, I described how important it was to me to have a family, even if no one else saw the value in it. I didn't write just for them. I wrote for myself. I wanted to record, unhurriedly, every sacrifice I never asked for recognition, every difficult choice that never became a family conversation. In the notes, I wrote the exact dates of moments that marked my life. March 3rd, 1994, the night you got sick and I spent 48 sleepless hours by your side. October 20th, 2007, the day Anna forgot her coat at school and I crossed the city to get it before it snowed. Small details, but ones only a mother remembers. Little by little, I realized the goal wasn't to throw everything in my children's faces or instill guilt. It was simply to show them what they were missing by treating me as if I didn't exist. I decided to separate some of these letters and recipes to share not only with Lucas and Anna, but also with other people in the neighborhood, mothers who, like me, have felt the bitter taste of being ignored. I made copies, wrote dedications, and prepared envelopes. It wasn't revenge, nor was it uncontrolled venting. It was a way of making it clear that, even forgotten, I was still here, with my whole story to tell. Late that afternoon, I sat alone at the table, looked at the stack of letters, the photos, the dresses lined up side by side, and understood that this plan wasn't about hurting my children. It was about opening their eyes, and maybe mine too, to everything I've done, everything I've lived, everything it means to be a mother. The plan wasn't to hurt, it was to show them what they were missing. The following Sunday, I woke up feeling more clear-headed than I had in a long time. I went straight to the living room, grabbed the finished letters, reviewed every word, and reread every passage I'd written without hesitation. I tucked the envelopes under my arm, walked to the door, opened the mailbox in front of my house, and placed a letter addressed to Lucas and another to Anna. In the corner of the envelope, I wrote in my own handwriting, "Read to the end." I didn't send it via app or text message. I made sure they felt the weight of the paper in their hands, like holding something they can't dismiss with a click. I didn't stop there. Before 10 in the morning, I sat down at my computer, opened the neighborhood Facebook group, and then opened the bulletin board for the Maple Street Methodist Church, where I'd attended for 20 years. I wrote a version of the letter, adapting it to avoid naming names, but without hiding my pain. I spoke of the silence of Mother's Day, the table set for no one, the coffee cup growing cold, the years I'd dedicated every minute to managing everything alone. I recounted details only those who experience it know. How many times I'd sewn a last-minute dress for a neighbor's daughter, how many birthday cakes I'd baked without a single congratulations in return, how many nights I'd spent sewing wedding dresses, hoping for at least a thank you. I wrote it this way, in the most raw way, because I realized there was no point in keeping it to myself any longer. I made it clear, without directly accusing, that abandonment wasn't just physical absence, but also the indifference of those who should have been there. I gathered old photos of wedding dresses I made for clients from the neighborhood, attached testimonials from women who came here to get their dream dress ready, and left with a piece of my story. I also published thank you notes from old friends, some messages from neighbors, even letters I wrote to myself on cold nights when I felt like the whole world had forgotten my name. It wasn't easy to share these memories, but I understood I had nothing left to lose. I did it calmly, because, unlike yelling or fighting, that was my way of showing. I'm here, and my story exists. At first, I didn't receive a response, but on Monday, the first reactions arrived. I received a note from a neighbor who always greeted me from afar. "How come you spent Mother's Day alone? I thought your children always visited you." In the church group, the post received unexpected comments. "I've never met anyone more dedicated to family than you, Martha. My daughter still talks about the dress you sewed for her." And then the calls began, one after the other, some just to check on me, others bringing up memories of past parties, of afternoons spent sewing together. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my story wasn't invisible. Lucas received the letter on Wednesday morning, Anna on Thursday. They didn't reply immediately, nor did they try to call me that same day. I imagined what they felt when they opened the envelope, reading each line detailing sleepless nights, impromptu birthdays, the struggle to keep everything running smoothly when no one else seemed to care. I didn't want them to feel anger or guilt, but I knew each word was a mirror. Those paragraphs were different from cold phone messages. They were the truth in print, impossible to erase. While waiting for a reaction, I continued responding to messages from my neighbors. I received flowers at the door, homemade cookies left on the porch, and even neighborhood children came to show me drawings they'd made for me. I saw a mix of surprise and respect in people's eyes. Some asked if I wanted to talk, others just left words of support. And even without my children around, I began to realize that that gesture had changed me more than I'd imagined. Every night before bed, I'd look at the stack of letters I'd sent, the comments I'd received, the little gifts piled up on the living room table. I was afraid of what might come, but for the first time, I felt no shame or desire to disappear. I was there, present, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to be erased. And in that silence, between one message and the next, all I could think was, I didn't know how they would react, but I was ready to never be invisible again. The following days passed slowly, but the mood in the neighborhood changed. It only took one weekend for my story to spread not only among neighbors, but also to my children's circle of friends. On Saturday, Anna sent me a simple message asking if I would be home on Sunday afternoon. Lucas didn't send anything, but at 4 p.m, I heard the sound of the car pulling up to the door. I saw through the window. The two of them came down together, their steps short, their eyes lowered, their simple clothes unsure if they should be there. They rang the doorbell as if they were guests, not children who had grown up in that same room. I opened the door, said nothing, just made room for them to enter. The awkwardness was heavy, each of us trying to find something to say, but the words stuck. They sat on the couch side by side, not daring to look at me. I didn't offer coffee, didn't try to bring up the subject of the weather. I went to the bookshelf and took out the journals I'd been filling since 2011. A thin stack of notebooks, some with wrinkled covers, others faded with age. I placed the journals in Anna and Lucas's hands and spoke only once, without raising my voice. Read them. Then tell me if I really mean nothing to you. They began to leaf through it, slowly. Anna's eyes landed on a page filled with notes about the nights she'd had a fever, and I jotted down every temperature, every medication, every silent plea for her to get better soon. Lucas read the excerpt about a birthday she'd received a used bicycle. I mentioned in the diary that I'd sold my spare sewing machine to afford the gift. There were pages about Anna's graduation party, details of how I'd sewn her dress until the wee hours of the morning, without telling her the fabric cost half my salary that month. They read in silence, occasionally wiping their eyes, trying to hide their tears, but failing. There were no direct accusations. Each line was simply a faithful portrait of what I experienced for them. Amidst the records were the silent pleas for attention. Days I waited for a simple phone call. Sunday afternoons I made excuses to appear busy just so I wouldn't admit I was expecting their visit. There was also gratitude for the little I received in return. Old Mother's Day notes glued between the pages, drawings from their childhood, some pressed flowers Lucas picked from the garden in 1995. With each new passage, it was as if they understood the weight of having a mother present but invisible. The tears came without warning, not from anger or shame, but from a stark realization. They were hurt too, even without realizing it. Anna hugged me first. It took a few seconds for her to speak, but she didn't apologize. She just stood there, silent, squeezing my hand. Lucas sat on the floor, looking at the old photos I'd kept in one of the journals, tears flowing slowly, without a sound. There was no need for grand speeches. All that was missing was someone admitting how much they missed each other. The pain I felt that Sunday wasn't just mine, and in that moment I realized it. Each of us carried a part of that silence. They never imagined their absence would be so loud. When they finished reading, Anna closed the diary, looked at me, and said softly, "I didn't know." Lucas shook his head, speechless. There was no need to say anything else. In that moment, I realized my pain wasn't just mine. They carried scars too. After that Sunday, the house was never the same, but it was also never invisible again. The letter I wrote to the neighborhood group spread in a way I never imagined. On Tuesday, I found a vase of yellow flowers on my doorstep with a note from a woman named Diane, whom I only knew by sight. On the envelope, she wrote, "Thank you for speaking what so many of us feel and hide." In the following days, more messages arrived. Some mothers left cards thanking me for having the courage to turn pain into words. Others said they read the story to their children and that for the first time in years, they received a sincere hug, the kind that doesn't happen just because the calendar dictates. The phone rang more times that week than it had in the previous 3 months. A woman from the Methodist Church called just to say she considered me part of her family. I received cakes, bread, even a drawing of a little girl I'd never seen, with the words, "You matter." Acquaintances who always hurried past on the sidewalk stopped to chat, ask if I wanted coffee with them, to see how I was truly feeling. For the first time, I heard people say my story helped other women feel less guilty about hurting themselves. One wrote to me, "I thought I was the only one who felt forgotten. Your courage woke me up." Lucas and Anna started visiting more often. They didn't come with promises or rehearsed phrases. They came with silence, eye contact, and a willingness to listen. Anna started calling almost every week, sometimes just to ask if I'd seen a new movie, other times to ask for a cake recipe. Lucas offered to help me replace the basement heater before winter, and one night he sat with me on the porch until late, listening to stories I never wanted to hear as a teenager. They knew nothing would be the same, and perhaps never would be. Time doesn't come back. It doesn't erase absence, but something settled inside. They understood, in their own way, that love isn't enough if it's kept silent. I changed too. I felt proud of not having remained silent, proud of not having accepted that pain as if it were fate. I looked at each flower I received, each letter I kept, and felt a kind of dignity that no one can take from me. I felt respected, seen. I discovered that it wasn't just my story. It was a portrait of so many people who also miss someone, but pretend everything is fine. At 65, I learned that not every ending is a new beginning, but there is victory in not accepting invisibility. Standing up after being ignored was the greatest gift I ever gave myself. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply showing that no one is born to be forgotten. The weight of memories is still there, and perhaps always will be. But the world saw who I was, not just my children, but the entire neighborhood. With every message, every hug, every lingering look at the gate, I was reminded that having a voice means not letting history die. And it was in that moment, when I thought I had nothing left to receive, that I understood. I was never truly alone. You know, for a long time, I thought my story would end in silence, hidden in a corner, like so many lives of women who did everything without asking for anything in return. But today it became clear. There is strength in the voice of those who refuse to be erased. Every flower that arrived at my door, every letter I received, every tight hug I received from the neighbors, didn't just serve to fill a void. It served to show me, and to show you who are listening, that dignity is not a favor. It is a right. Everyone carries a story that deserves to be told, and no one should be reduced to silence or indifference. It's not easy to admit you were left aside by the ones you love most. But the courage to speak out is what restored my respect, both inside and outside the home. I transformed pain into words. I transformed abandonment into action. And here I am. I know this story affected you. You felt the weight of every choice, every absence, every scar left by the distance from those who were supposed to care. Stories like this are no exception. They're the rule for many people. And when someone has the courage to speak out, the impact doesn't stop with the one who tells it. It touches those who listen, transforms those who watch. You are part of this story now. So, now it's your turn. I want to see in the comments, tell me what you would do in my place, or tell your own story. Anyone who has felt the weight of abandonment, anyone who has had to scream to be heard, leave your mark here. Write, I do not accept being invisible. I want to read each story, understand how you faced or are facing indifference. Don't go through this in silence. Share it, because your testimony can transform the day of those listening with you. This story resonated with you. Leave a like now, because every time you support stories like this, they gain even more strength to reach those who truly need it. Subscribe to the channel, because only here will you find real stories that defy the impossible. stories of survival and courage that truly change lives. It's not just entertainment, it's a movement of people who refuse to be forgotten. Every video, every testimony, every comment, all of this creates a community of resistance against silence. You're already part of this story just by coming this far. Subscribe to continue following stories that push boundaries, that challenge you to look within and never again accept the loneliness imposed by others. And prepare your heart, because what's to come will shake even more everything you believe about pain, courage, and survival. The next video is already on screen. Click now and come with me to discover what's impossible to forget. And before you leave, remember this: if you've ever felt left out by the ones you love most, know that your story matters. Your pain is not small, and your voice deserves to be heard. Journaling was my refuge, the way I found to keep from going crazy, to understand that even in the longest nights, there's still strength hidden within us. I survived abandonment because I learned to see value in myself, and you can too. No one is invisible when they decide to show themselves to the world. Find your strength. Don't accept anything less than respect. Don't accept loneliness as a sentence. Here, every story is a new beginning. Declare your existence, make your voice heard, and come discover the next story, because no one here will be forgotten.